1,000 years of history under one roof. The National Archives, a treasure house of secrets. The records of extraordinary times and people. These files are this nation's story, our shared past.
Documents housed here were highly classified, intended for the eyes of only the privileged few, protected from your sight for decades, but not now.
I've been granted special access to files once kept hush-hush. I'll unearth amazing tales from our hidden history. Forget what you've been told. These documents tell the truth. In this program, national security and the birth of a legend. The secret letter that preceded the storming of the Iranian embassy by the SAS.
One of the terrorists was hidden amongst them with a hand grenade in his hand, and 3 of us shot him at exactly the same time.
And the moment that you put a bullet in the terrorist, what was your sensation then?
Nothing, really. Job done.
Thinking the unthinkable. Churchill's plan for war on Russia with the Germans as allies.
They don't imagine that the SS are going to be involved, at least in the early months.
Right.
But the Wehrmacht definitely.
And a conspiracy to decapitate the British cabinet. How violent revolutionaries plotted to take over.
This, which looks strangely like a kitchen recipe, except it's for a fireball.
The first duty of the state is the protection of its citizens.
Acting on information that came through yesterday evening, an elite group of officers from MI5, the Metropolitan Police Anti-Terrorist Branch and West Midlands Police gathered in Birmingham for a pre-dawn raid.
And today, the state is kept very busy with threats of attack constantly in the news.
Detectives have been combing the route of the train to London the men took last week. This evening, police carried out a controlled explosion on a car at Luton Station. The area remains sealed off.
For obvious reasons, national security is cloaked in secrecy. Decades can pass before operational details are revealed. Here in the National Archives, I've discovered an extraordinary dossier that sheds new light on an infamous terrorist siege that many of us remember.
It all began when 3 armed men seized a lone police guard outside the embassy, bundled him inside and fired 3 shots. Seconds later, Iranian women rushed screaming from the building, and seconds after that, the first reinforcements arrived.
In April 1980, armed men forced their way into the Iranian embassy in London, taking 26 people hostage. They wanted to draw the world's attention to political prisoners held by Iran's new revolutionary leader, Ayatollah Khomeini. The sixth gunmen demanded those prisoners' release and safe passage out of the United Kingdom for themselves. As millions watched the siege on TV, another drama was unfolding behind the scenes. The Iranians made contact with the Thatcher government in London.
To see something on television is only half the story. You find out the rest when you open the files. For a start, the Iranian embassy was considered Iranian territory, and the British government could only legally assault it with an invitation. Here is the invitation, and it was delivered in the most extraordinarily flowery diplomatic language. The Embassy of the Islamic Republic of Iran presents its compliments to His Excellency the Foreign Secretary and has the honour to draw to His Excellency's attention the incidents at this embassy today in which lives of 20-odd diplomats and staff, including the chargé d'affaires and several women, is under constant threat of death. It is requested that His Excellency the Foreign Secretary will appreciate the severity of the threat and will order the security forces to take all possible measures to safeguard lives.
That letter authorised Britain's Home Secretary to do whatever was needed to end the siege. In Whitehall, civil servants urgently considered how the siege might conclude and the consequences of each possibility. Best outcome? Terrorist surrender. Worst outcome? Emergency shootout. Intermediate outcomes? Let terrorists go with all hostages, let them go with some hostages, let them go with no hostages. Whoever wrote this memo didn't know Margaret Thatcher. For her, any option that began "let terrorists go" would have been considered as a worst option.
What makes you believe that taking over the embassy in London will force the Iranian government to carry out your demands?
You know, it is one of the means that we want to send our voice to the world.
Are you saying that all the hostages are safe tonight?
What?
All the hostages are safe tonight?
Yeah.
In the first days of the siege, the authorities focused on negotiation, making minor concessions, such as broadcasting the gunmen's demands. As a result, 5 hostages were released, but the terrorists became impatient. On the 6th day of the siege, everything changed. The gunmen inside the embassy became frustrated that their major demands were not being met. They put 3 bullets into one of the hostages and bundled his body out of the front door, threatening to kill more hostages. The Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police sought the government's permission to hand the situation over to the British Army.
Something's got to be done because they're killing hostages. Then you've got to go in, you've got to blow the doors, you've got to blow the windows, you've got to attack and hope for the best.
Robin Horsfall was one of a 40-strong SAS team put on immediate standby. As they readied themselves, their commanding officers gathered intelligence and planned an attack.
There are 54 rooms in that building and 5 floors. The idea was to hit every room, every entrance, every entry point at exactly the same time to create that speed and surprise and shock.
Robin's SAS unit was transported to London in secrecy and housed in the Royal College of General Practitioners 2 doors away from the Iranian embassy. Here they awaited the order to go.
40 of us cooped up in there, watching the embassy snooker championships on television hour after hour, the most exciting thing ever. We got a little bit carried away occasionally, playing silly games, drilling holes in each other's mugs of tea, and one guy got his training shoes nailed to the floor, as soldiers do when they're bored. The police thought we were complete and utter idiots.
But shortly afterwards, the SAS demonstrated their serious side. At 7:23 p.m, Operation Nimrod began. It put a secret and shadowy organisation on prime-time television. So which level were you coming in at?
I was on this level, the ground floor level, on the back door. The assault started. As I'm standing on the back door, the guys are abseiling down the back of the building. Tom Morell gets his hand and glove caught in his abseil harness, and he gets stuck above the window. The guys beneath him have gone through, thrown in the flashbangs, the windows have caught fire, the flames are lapping up underneath him, and he's starting to burn alive, hanging on this rope. So he's kicking himself out away from the building, and he's about 25 feet up above the concrete floor. The guys on the roof, seeing him stuck, are trying to cut the rope under tension to drop him down on the balcony. But if they cut the rope while he's swinging outwards, he's going to go over the balcony and die. As I'm standing there looking up at him with nothing to do, 3 rounds came through the window, and I think, oh, the guys are in there doing their job, through the window. Hector is on the radio, and he goes, reserves go in. So we go through the door, and the hostages are coming down. One of the terrorists was hidden amongst them with a hand grenade in his hand, and 3 of us shot him at exactly the same time. He had 27 holes in him, and he collapsed and died immediately.
And the moment that you put a bullet in a terrorist, what was your sensation then?
Nothing really, job done. It was no more relevant than to have a slice of toast in the morning. It was easy. People make a great furore about the emotional difficulties of killing somebody, but if you've been trained to do that since the age of 15 and to do it properly and do it for the right reasons, then it's not a difficult thing to do at all.
Early in the operation, the gunman killed another hostage. By the time it was over, just 15 minutes later, 5 of the terrorists were dead, the 6th in handcuffs. 19 hostages were rescued, and the SAS emerged as international heroes.
The reaction of the whole world was amazing. It was the biggest news that this nation had since the death of Winston Churchill. It was massive, and everybody wanted to know us.
Amongst the first on the scene to congratulate the soldiers was the Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher, who watched with them television reports of the operation. Britain's special forces had acquired a fearsome reputation.
Do you think the operation made Britain a safer place?
The operation definitely made Britain a safer place for a long time, because the mythology that grew around our special forces protected us for a long period of time. It frightened people, so instead of mounting an operation here, they went somewhere else to do it.
With the dramatic assault across these balconies, Britain gained an overnight reputation for zero tolerance of terrorism. The Iranians, of course, were pleased that the siege had been lifted, but they also had reason for complaint. Just before the siege began, they had written to Britain's diplomatic protection group, warning that they needed extra security, saying in their letter that forces hostile to Iran are planning acts of sabotage.
After the siege was over, the Iranians complained that though their letter of warning had been received, it had been ignored. As these files show, a Whitehall official was told to investigate.
The civil servant here says, "I spoke to the chief superintendent and he categorically denied the story." But a few days later, he's checked his records and confirms that a letter from the Iranians was sent to the diplomatic protection group.
But that wasn't the end of the correspondence, because it's now emerged that shortly after the British received the warning letter from the Iranians, they had written back.
The diplomatic protection group replied that it kept the political climate affecting Iran under constant review, and it pledged to accord to the embassy our urgent attention at all times. Unfortunately, this reassuring reply was delivered to the embassy only after the siege was over. During World War II, Britain moved from the brink of defeat to victory, but emerged exhausted after 5 years of conflict. As Hitler neared his defeat, Winston Churchill was planning a new confrontation against a new enemy.
In these fascinating files, we learn that Winston Churchill was prepared to contemplate total war against Russia. These files, labelled Russia Threat to Western Civilization, and of course marked Top Secret, reveal the idea of opening a war against Russia on the 1st of July 1945. The overall or political object is to impose upon Russia the will of the United States and the British Empire, and that is initialed WSC, Winston Spencer Churchill, 10th of June 1945. The assessment of the military planners is not optimistic. The result of a total war with Russia is not possible to forecast, but the one thing certain
is that to win, it would take us a very long time. For those in Eastern Europe who may believe that the Allies reached a pretty feeble peace with the Soviet Union at the end of the European War, it may be of interest to know that Winston Churchill, at least, was prepared to think the unthinkable.
How could he contemplate another war when we were just completing our defeat of the Nazis? Because the Russians had imposed communism in parts of Eastern Europe, including Poland, which was intolerable since Britain had guaranteed Polish independence and gone to war for it 6 years before.
This is a secret that's lain entombed for quite a long time.
Exactly, and I believe the document that's in the National Archives is the only one that is in the public domain.
Did Churchill mean it seriously? I mean, I just wonder, was he trying to assuage his conscience? And he thought, well, I better look at this, I better see whether it's feasible. Or did Churchill really believe that we could spend, I don't know, another 3 or 4 years fighting Russia?
Of course, Churchill's passions swing high and low during this period. One minute he's thinking he can deal with Stalin, the next minute he's totally fed up and angry with Stalin. So he does swing emotionally.
Господин премьер-министр Великобритании, начальник почетного караула, капитан Гуркин.
Churchill's war plans are a shock, and so is his idea of the alliance that he might put together.
One of the things that astonished me about the file is the thought that the German army could fight alongside the British army against the Russians, and when Hitler is scarcely cold in his grave.
Exactly. The Germans are not designed to come into the conflict on the 1st of July, the start date of operations. It's thought they're going to be introduced some months later, after the Allies have equipped them properly and how they've trained together. They don't imagine that the SS are going to be involved, at least in the early months. But the Wehrmacht definitely.
Do I worry?
When he received the opinion of his military chiefs, Churchill faced up to reality. Operation Unthinkable was unachievable, particularly as it needed the support of the Americans, who weren't prepared to give it. But his fears about Stalin's aggression proved to be well-founded.
Do I worry? You can bet your life I do.
Do you see it just as another example of his extraordinary breadth of vision, that he could think about another war?
I think he was extremely realistic of the problems we had with the Soviet Union then. And of course, as the months go on, the Americans start to realise the sense that Churchill is talking. The Americans are waking up to the threat from Stalin, and they have their own version of Operation Unthinkable, Operation Pincher, which is thinkable.
And what does that result in?
That results eventually in nuclear war.
Do I worry? You can bet your life I do.
The British have a long and proud history of peaceful protest. No one makes a placard better. But some groups want nothing short of revolution. In the early 1800s, Britain was gripped by an age of austerity. The Napoleonic Wars had recently ended, and thousands of unemployed former sailors and soldiers came back to Civvy Street, trying and failing to find work. There were demonstrations and riots. So serious was the unrest that the government brought in new measures, forbidding crowds from gathering in the streets. But it was behind closed doors that a bloody coup was being planned. A document I've unearthed at the National Archives reveals the horrifying plot hatched by anti-government radicals in 1820 to assassinate the British cabinet. This was the Cato Street conspiracy.
What was it all about? Well, here are their aims expressed in a coded message. It was sent in strips which could then be pieced together by the recipients. And this is an appeal to the army to mutiny. Brave soldiers, the tyrants are no more. Make common cause with the people. Think of your fathers, mothers, and friends. Be just to the miseries that they have long endured. Be just to yourselves. Be brave and be free. Join the people.
Strong language indeed. But the rebels weren't fighting a war of words. They were cooking up something lethal. So dangerous that its ingredients will now be bleeped.
This, which looks strangely like a kitchen recipe, except it's for a fireball. Take 2 ounces of 2 ounces of melt together, and when beginning to cool, add 2 ounces of make it into a ball with a fuse fixed in from the centre, composed of.
And if bombs weren't terrible enough, their plans for the cabinet were grisly.
These pike heads, 250 of them, they are vicious little implements, very, very sharp, with nasty little teeth and grooves. One of them had said that he intended to use his knife to cut off the heads of 2 members of the cabinet, Sidmouth and Castlereagh, and then to display their heads on pikes.
Despite their careful preparations, the rebels were doomed to failure. One of their number, George Edwards, was a government spy. He'd been feeding details of the plot to the authorities. As the conspirators assembled in London's Cato Street, ready to start their revolution, they were about to discover that they'd been betrayed.
Behind this tiny facade, a plot of immeasurable audacity was underway. This was a dilapidated tenement, a stable below with a loft above, reached by a ladder. On the evening of the 23rd of February 1820, the building was stormed by a dozen policemen, Bow Street runners, who didn't wait for the Coldstream Guards who were in reserve. During the course of the attack, a policeman was killed. A large number of traitors made their escape, but a smaller number was apprehended, and the conspiracy was thwarted. This was the very room where the police found the conspirators. A contemporary illustration shows the leader, Arthur Thistlewood, fatally stabbing one of the Bow Street runners, John Smithers. There was a scene of pandemonium. But at the end of it, there was a cache of arms and explosives, providing easily enough evidence to convict the conspirators.
Their trial revealed something sensational. Not only had George Edwards, the government mole, been spying on the rebels, he was an agent provocateur. He'd actively encouraged them in their plans to murder cabinet members. Why would the government risk promoting a revolution? Professor John Gardner has his own theory.
I think the best way to avoid a revolution is to create one and then to publicly crush it. In May of 1820, the 5 conspirators were executed at Newgate in front of massive crowds. It said that 100,000 people had seen them being executed there. And what happened is they were hanged and then decapitated. And this had a real deadening effect, because it seemed that the government was so ruthlessly well organised that they could crush a rebellion before it had even happened.
If the idea was to discourage other treacherous plots, it was effective.
There were no executions for high treason again until at least the Risings in 1916. So it's a real watershed moment. That's the last time that anybody is executed for high treason for almost 100 years.
The Cato Street plot was undermined by a highly effective mole placed inside the conspiracy. Ever since then, the authorities have been tempted to infiltrate protest groups, fearing their radical agenda, sometimes with highly controversial results.
I'm meeting Dr. Rory Cormack at a London hotel once populated by the intelligence services. He knows the rules of the spying game.
Is there much of a difference, really, between infiltrating a foreign organisation, an enemy power, and infiltrating organisations at home of your own citizens?
The big difference between infiltrating foreign organisations and domestic ones is going to be the idea of ethics, the idea of how right it is to monitor and put surveillance on your own subjects. It muddies the water slightly. People are generally okay with a government doing things against people overseas. When it's done closer to home, deeper questions get asked.
I was very struck in the case of the Cato Street conspiracy. It is alleged that the government spy was actually so much at the heart of it that there would not have been a conspiracy, at least in that form, if he hadn't been part of it, the government plant. Can you think of other instances where that may have been the case?
It's an interesting allegation, the idea of using an agent provocateur, I suppose. And there are no other instances I can think of which have been proven where governments have deliberately instigated some sort of subversion in order to clamp down on it.
It's the equivalent of the controlled explosion, isn't it? If you know that something may go off at a time not of your choosing, it's perhaps better to make it go off at a time that you have selected.
Yes, and there's a perfectly logical and valid way of looking at it. One of the difficulties when we talk about intelligence is so much of this stuff classified, and when we're looking at contemporary examples in operations against Al-Qaeda or whomever, we simply don't yet know, and I for one, as a historian, am really looking forward to finding out the files in 30, 40, 50 years' time.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to presenting the programmes in 30 or 40 years' time. In 1820, here in Cato Street, and in 1980 in Prince's Gate, British security forces raided London houses with deadly success. Even more audacious was the plan in July 1945 to attack the Soviet Union, a raid to seize back Poland, not surprisingly codenamed Operation Unthinkable. Unthinkable to everyone, perhaps, except Winston Churchill, one of the boldest minds in history.